In this video, we're looking at exchange rates, trying to build a fundamental understanding of how it works. And in the future, we'll be looking at different factors that will affect the exchange rate. And lastly, how the exchange rate is going to affect the current account balance, macroeconomic goals, and also our living standards. So when questions ask you what are the factors affecting the exchange rate, what it really is saying is how is the exchange rate determined? How do we know that it's 0.8 in one year and maybe 0.7 in another year? And what are the potential factors or reasons that have either pushed the exchange rate up or down? So first, the definition of the exchange rate is the price of one country's currency in terms of another. And the reason we use an exchange rate is because countries want to be paid in their own currency. And so if I'm trying to purchase something overseas, they're not going to accept my foreign currency because it has no value to them. So what I'm required to do first is purchase their currency using my own currency. And once I obtain that currency, I can then exchange it for the good or service that I want. And so anytime we're dealing with the exchange rate, you should be thinking about it as having two separate transactions. And you should also think about the currency as being its own individual good. Now, before we get into it, it's important to note that we can measure the exchange rate in two different ways. We can compare our currency to exactly one other country's currency. And typically, Australia usually denominates their exchange rate based on the US dollar. But we can also use the second type of measurement, which is the trade weighted index. And it's a lot like the consumer price index, where we are combining all the different prices of goods and services in one hypothetical basket. However, instead of looking at the prices of goods and services, we're looking at the price of total different currencies. And so it gives us a better picture because it looks at how our exchange rate might be performing on average based on every other country. Another thing to note is that Australia adopts a free floating exchange rate, which means we allow the exchange rate to appreciate or depreciate based on the demand and supply of the currency. Now, not all countries do this. There are certain countries that prefer to have a fixed exchange rate. And the reason why countries may prefer a fixed exchange rate is because they want a little bit more certainty with the goods and services they exchange in terms of costs or prices they may incur. And it also might give a greater confidence for future investors or future consumers that are purchasing from that country. So since we're only looking at the demand and supply of the Australian currency, here's a list of some reasons why the demand and supply is going to change. So starting with demand, thinking about why would other countries want to buy our currency? And remember that we're thinking about currency as being its own individual good or service. Some of the reasons could be that nations may want to buy Australian exports, overseas investors may want to invest money into Australia, and other countries may be lending to Australia. And so the common theme as to why there's a demand for AUD is because they want to purchase our products. And so overall, we will be experiencing an inflow of our currency. Now, the reason why we supply AUD is because we may want to be purchasing imports, we may be investing in other countries, or we may be repaying loans and interest payments overseas. So like I said, anytime that we are exchanging currency, there's actually a two-step process that's occurring. Now, if you've been fortunate enough to travel overseas, it's quite likely there was a point in time where you had to go to a currency exchange place to exchange your Australian dollars into the currency of the country you were in. And so let's actually take a dive and think about what's actually occurring in this simple transaction. What you're actually doing is purchasing their currency, which then allows you to purchase goods and services in that country. And so what we can call this middle place is the foreign exchange market. And what's happening is that the currency can go in and can go out. And based on the differences between the inflows and outflows of currencies, that is going to determine what the exchange rate is. Now, if that image is still slightly confusing, then hopefully this next visual is going to help you get an understanding of how the exchange rate works as well. So we have three parties. We have Australian people, we have the foreign exchange market, and we have the world. So for example, let's say that we are purchasing something from overseas, perhaps brand new sneakers. In order to make this purchase, the Australian person must first visit the exchange market to obtain the correct currency. And so since we're kind of pushing our currency away from our country and into the foreign exchange market, you can think about it as us supplying AUD into the FXM. And so once this transaction is complete, then the money goes to the other country, and in return, the Australian person will receive their good or service. Now on the flip side, other countries may want to purchase Australian products. And so in order for them to purchase our products, they also need to exchange our currency, which means that they demand the Australian dollar. And in the same regard, once they obtain our currency, it then transfers into our country, and then we will pass on the good or service that they are required. And so let's look at how this is going to affect the exchange rate. So let's connect the dots here. Remember that we're treating the currency as an individual good or service. And so if we're trying to look at the appreciation of the Australian dollar, there are two possibilities that will increase the equilibrium price. That is going to be if there's a shift right in the demand curve, or if there's a shift left in the supply curve. And so if we look at this diagram, we're thinking, okay, why would the Australian dollar ever shift right? And if we go back to the table, we know that there are fundamentally three reasons why people would want our Australian dollar. Now, to put it simply, it is because other countries want to purchase Australian goods or services. Now, this purchase could be final goods, or it also could be investments, but it also could be other countries having to pay us back money. For example, if we've made an investment into an American company, and they are now paying back us dividends, we don't want to be paid back in American dollars. So what that company has to do is first convert their currency into an appropriate Australian dollar amount and then send that money to us. And by doing so, they are demanding our AUD. Now, the reason why the supply curve could shift left is because we are now supplying less money into the foreign exchange market, which is a sign that we are purchasing less imports, or we are also making less outflows of payments to other countries. Now, we can use the exact same example to look at why the Australian dollar is going to depreciate. And it's going to occur for two reasons. The demand curve may shift left, or the supply curve may shift right. Now, it's important to note that when we're thinking about the demand and supply curve of the Australian currency, we're not talking about the money that exists within our country, nor are we talking about the currency that exists in other countries. We are simply talking about the demand and supply of the currency within the foreign exchange market, thinking about that three-party diagram that we've worked with. And so looking back at this depreciation, the demand of AUD may shift left because people want our products less, or the supply curve may shift right if Australians are demanding more foreign goods and services. So this concludes the first video on exchange rates. Hopefully you have a better understanding of the fundamentals surrounding how the exchange rate is determined. In the next video, we'll be looking at the specific factors that will influence the exchange rate.